Nora Calloway woke up before the alarm the way she always did, not because she was a light sleeper, but because some part of her had never fully trusted that the morning would come without her watching for it. She lay still for a moment in the narrow bed above the coin laundry and looked at the watch on her wrist before she looked at anything else. The face was cracked corner to corner, a fine web of a fracture that caught the light and scattered it in thin lines across the ceiling. Her last foster mother had pressed it into her hand the morning she aged out 4 months ago now, and the woman had not said much because she was not a woman who wasted words. Be on time, she had told her. Be on time and people will trust you. Nora had believed her. She had believed her the way you believe the first solid thing anyone ever hands you with both hands and without question, because there is nothing else to hold on to. She dressed in the dark the way she did every morning, 3 minutes from eyes open to boots laced, because the salvage yard on the south end of Delwood, Oregon opened at 7, and she was always there by 6:15. Always. In 2 years of working for Rex Garrett, she had never once been late. Not in the deep freeze of January when the Ridge Road iced over and she walked the last half mile because the bus stopped running. Not in August when the heat came up off the gravel in waves and the metal in the yard was too hot to touch with bare hands. She was there because being there was the one thing she knew how to do perfectly, and she had learned young that perfection in a small thing was the only currency a girl with no people could spend. The yard sat at the edge of town where Delwood stopped trying to be a town and gave way to the river flats. 4 acres of stacked cars and engine blocks, and the slow rust that crept into everything within a quarter mile of the water. She liked it. She liked it in a way she had never been able to say out loud without feeling like she was admitting something embarrassing. Machines told you the truth about themselves. A motor that knocked was telling you something. A bearing that whined was telling you something. You listened, you paid attention, you found the problem, and the problem could be fixed. She had never once in her life been able to say the same about a person. She had learned engines the way she learned everything else on her own time and with borrowed materials. Library books she renewed until the librarian stopped asking. Diagrams she copied by hand into a spiral notebook because she was not allowed to take the reference books home. Motors she took apart in her mind during the long, quiet hours of other people's houses, lying in borrowed beds in borrowed rooms, mapping the parts in the dark until she could see the whole mechanism turning behind her eyes. When she finally got her hands on real engines at Garrett's, she already knew them the same way a person knows a place they have dreamed about before they ever visit, with a recognition that is not quite memory and not quite instinct, but lives in the space between. Rex Garrett had hired her off the street 2 winters back. He had asked her 3 questions, looked at her hands, and told her she started Monday. That had felt like kindness at the time, and she had paid it back the only way she knew, by showing up and by being useful. His son worked the yard too. Cole Garrett was 26 and quick with a smile and always a little behind on something she could not quite name. He came in late, took long lunches, spent his time on the phone with the screen tilted away from whoever was nearby. Nora had learned in her first week not to look too hard at the screen. She had learned in her second week that Rex loved his son the same way men love complicated things, without fully understanding them and without wanting to. It was a love that had never learned to ask hard questions of itself, and that kind of love in Nora's experience was the most dangerous variety. The morning it ended started like every other morning. Nora was under a flatbed by 6:30, her back on the cold creeper, working a seized caliper that had been seized since before she started. She heard Rex's boots on the gravel before she saw him. A man's footsteps tell you his mood before his face does. These were fast and hard and not going anywhere good. She slid out and stood up and wiped her hands on the rags she kept in her back pocket. Rex was already standing over her, and Cole was behind him, arms crossed, looking at the middle distance in the particular fashion of someone who has decided where to look in advance. "Office," Rex said. "Now." The office was a single-wide trailer with a space heater and a metal desk and a wall safe behind a calendar from 3 years ago that no one had taken down. Rex sat behind the desk. Cole leaned against the filing cabinet. Nora stood in front of the desk and waited. "Safe short $4,000, Rex said. He said it the same way you read a parts number off a manifest. Flat and factual and already decided. And the Hutchins block is gone. The restored 327, the one the man paid up front for, sold right off my lot. Nora looked from Rex to Cole and back. I don't know anything about that. Cole says different. Rex's jaw worked. He says he saw you, near the safe, Tuesday night after close. I wasn't here Tuesday night. She kept her voice level even though her pulse had moved up into her ears. I was at the county library until 9. They've got cameras at the desk. The woman who runs the reference section knows my face. Cole made a sound that was almost a laugh. Real convenient. Rex held up one hand and Cole went quiet. Rex sat back in the chair and looked at Nora for a long moment. It was not anger yet. It was worse than anger. It was a man in the process of deciding, and she could see the scales tipping in real time, could see which way the weight was going before a single word confirmed it. You know what gets me, Rex said finally. I gave you a shot when nobody else in this county would have. You came in here with nothing. No references, no family, no address that wasn't a shelter on Birch Street. And I said, fine, come in Monday, let's see what you've got. 2 years I told people that girl works harder than men twice her age. 2 years I defended you when people in this town made their little comments. I didn't take your money, Rex. My boy is my blood. Rex said it quietly. You're a kid the state gave up on. He shook his head, and it was not a cruel gesture which almost made it worse. It was the gesture of a man who genuinely believed he was being reasonable. I should have known better than to trust someone nobody else would trust. The words went into her the way cold water goes into the lungs. She had heard that sentence before in different rooms with different furniture and different people behind different desks. A kid the state gave up on. She had spent 2 years at this yard trying to outwork that sentence, trying to bury it under enough early mornings and enough honest labor that it would stop being the first thing anyone saw when they looked at her. Rex had just told her it was still the first thing he saw. It had always been the first thing he saw. She thought about the watch. She had been on time every single day for 2 years. She had cracked her knuckle on a rotor in November and wrapped it herself and been back under a car within the hour. She had stayed late 17 times without being asked and never once put in for overtime because she had not wanted to push her luck. Turned out being on time and being believed were two different things entirely, and no amount of early mornings could close the distance between them. Keys, Rex said, and held his hand out across the desk. She took the yard keys off her belt loop and set them on the desk. She did not drop them. She did not slam them. She set them down with the same care she used when she set a torque wrench back in the drawer, because that small precision was the only thing in the room that still belonged to her. I'm not calling the sheriff today, Rex said. Out of respect for the time you've put in, you come up with a 4,000 and we're done. You don't, and I make that call. You understand me, I understand you fine. She looked at him steadily. You've got it wrong, but I understand you. She looked at Cole one more time on her way to the door. He was staring at the floor. His jaw was set and a muscle was jumping in his cheek, that small involuntary percussion of a person holding something in very hard. She had seen guilt before at enough kitchen tables in enough houses to know exactly what it looked like when it was sitting right in front of her. But knowing a thing and proving it were two different animals. And Nora had never in her life been the person whose word got taken over someone else's. She walked out into the cold gray morning and did not look back at the yard. By noon it had gotten worse, as these things do. The man who owned the room above the laundry was not a cruel man. He was a careful man in a small town where word traveled faster than weather. He met her on the stairs with his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes somewhere around her left shoulder. Heard you got let go from Garrett's, he said. Heard the reason. It isn't true. Maybe not, but rent's due Friday and I can't carry a tenant who's out of work and got a cloud over her in a town this size. You see my position. She saw his position. She went up and packed her life into the duffel bag she had carried out of her last foster placement 14 months ago. It did not take long. 3 changes of clothes, a toothbrush, a paperback she had read 4 times, the spiral notebook full of engine diagrams she had copied by hand from library books and from the motors she had taken apart in her head during all the long, quiet years. She left the room cleaner than she found it because that was the kind of thing no one would ever notice. And she did it anyway because some habits are not about being seen. At the corner market, she laid her money out on the counter. $7 and change. She bought a loaf of bread and a packet of sliced turkey and a bottle of water and walked out with under $2 and the clothes on her back and a watch that told the right time and lied about everything else. She walked because standing still felt worse. The afternoon sky went the color of old pewter, and the wind came off the river low and flat, the kind of wind that finds every gap in a jacket. By the time the streetlights buzzed on, she had circled the south end of town twice, without quite deciding to, and her feet had carried her back toward the edge of things, back toward the river, back toward the one place she knew like the back of her own hand. She did not go back to be near the yard. She told herself she did not. But she ended up at the chain-link fence at the back of the property with her hands in her pockets, looking in at the dark shapes of dead cars stacked in rows. And she had no better explanation for herself than that this was the place she had spent the last 2 years, and a person goes toward the familiar when they have nowhere else to go. That was when the dog found her. He came from inside the fence, moving quiet for a big animal, and sat down on the other side of the chain link and looked at her with his ears forward. He was a German Shepherd mix, black and tan, gone gray around the muzzle and down the chest, with the deep, patient eyes of an animal that had seen enough to stop being surprised by anything. She had seen him around the back lot for months. He appeared near the old fire engine most mornings and disappeared somewhere in the afternoon, and Rex had said once that he had wandered in from somewhere and would not leave, and that he kept the rats off the back quarters so there was no reason to run him off. "Hey," she said softly, "you having a rough day too?" The dog's tail moved once a single, slow arc against the gravel. She tore a corner off the bread and pushed it under the fence. He took it from her fingers with a gentleness that was almost formal, and then he sat back and looked at her again, as though the bread had been a question and he was still considering his answer. The cold settled in for real once the last light left the sky. Her jacket was not made for November, and the bread was going fast, and her options had narrowed until they were essentially one. She looked across the lot at the shapes of things in the dark. Her eyes went where they always went in that yard, to the shape in the far corner that did not match anything else on the property. The fire engine had come from Station 9 on the north end of Delwood, the one the county had shut down 3 years ago when they consolidated the district. It had sat behind the empty firehouse, going slowly to pieces until the city arranged for Rex to haul it in for scrap. Nora had been there when they offloaded it. She had put her hand on the chrome bell mounted on the front bumper and felt something go tight in her chest without knowing why. Something that had nothing to do with anything she could name. Rex had a buyer for the steel. The crusher was booked for 3 days from now. 3 days, and the last engine from Station 9 would be a rectangle of compressed metal on its way to a foundry. She had cleaned that truck her second week at the yard before anyone told her not to bother. She had wiped decades of grime off the instrument panel and oiled the door hinges and sat in the driver's seat one afternoon with both hands on the big, thin steering wheel, just to sit there imagining the people who had ridden this truck through the dark toward other people's worst nights. It was the only thing in the lot that had ever made her feel like she was close to something larger than herself. She had not been able to explain that feeling then, and she could not explain it now. She only knew that the feeling was there, solid and unaccountable, every time she walked past the truck's red flank. Nobody would look for her there. Nobody wanted that truck. In that way, at least they had something in common. She waited until the light in the office trailer went dark and Rex's truck pulled out through the front gate. Then she walked the fence line to the spot where the bottom rail had worked loose from the post years ago. A gap she had noticed her first month and fixed in her head 100 times over and never reported, and she pushed the duffel through and crawled after it. The dog came too. He slipped through the gap behind her without hesitation, as though he had been waiting for exactly this, and he walked at her left heel across the gravel toward the back of the lot without making a sound. The fire engine was taller in the dark than she remembered. She tried the cab door, and it opened on the hinges. She had oiled herself, groaning once, and then swinging wide. She climbed up into the driver's seat, and the dog jumped up after her and turned twice, and lay down on the passenger side of the bench with his chin on his paws and his eyes on her calm as furniture. She reached over and put her hand on his side. He was warm. His ribs moved slow and steady under her palm, and the simple fact of another living thing breathing steadily next to her was so unfamiliar that it took her a moment to understand what she was feeling. Not comfort exactly, something quieter than comfort. The relief of not being the only warm thing in a cold space. She pulled her knees up and wrapped her arms around them and waited for her shivering to slow. Through the cracked windshield, the river caught what was left of the light and threw it back in broken pieces. Somewhere on the far side of the water, a freight train was working a long grade, and the sound of it carried across the flat ground like something that had been trying to get somewhere for a very long time. She thought about the watch. She thought about Rex's face when he said it, the flatness of it, the absolute absence of doubt. She thought about Cole standing at the filing cabinet, not looking at her, and the muscle in his jaw going and going. She thought about how a person can be exactly on time every day of their life and still lose everything before lunch to a lie someone else told, and how there is no clock for that, no mechanism you can take apart and fix. She had always known in the manner that children in the system learn certain things without being told that she was operating on a shorter margin than most people, that any mistake would cost her more, that any accusation would stick faster, that the benefit of the doubt was a luxury extended to people with roots, and she did not have roots. She had known this, and she had tried to outwork it, and tonight she was sitting in a dead fire truck in a salvage yard with $7 and the clothes on her back, and the knowing had turned out to be right all along. She did not cry. She had stopped crying sometime around age 11 when she understood that crying was something you did in the presence of someone who cared whether you cried, and there had not been a reliable supply of such people in her life. She had gotten out of the habit, and the habit had not returned. The cold would not let her sleep. She dug the small flashlight out of the duffel, the one she kept for working under vehicles in dim conditions, and clicked it on to find her water bottle. The beam moved across the instrument panel, across the fogged gauges, and the empty radio mount across the worn bench seat with its cracked vinyl and the yellow foam showing through the split. She shifted her weight to reach the water bottle, and the entire bench seat moved under her, sliding back on its track with a low metallic complaint moving farther than a seat should move. She stopped. She sat very still. She set the flashlight down and put both hands on the edge of the bench and pushed deliberately this time, and the seat slid back 2 more inches and stopped against something. There was a gap now between the back of the bench and the rear wall of the cab. A dark gap. A gap that should not have been there because she knew this truck. She had cleaned this truck. She had been in this cab before and there had been no gap. She picked up the flashlight and angled it down into the space behind the seat. The factory wall of the cab was there, but mounted in front of it, someone had fitted a second panel, sheet steel cut and shaped by hand and painted the same flat red as everything else so that it would disappear into the background. The bolts holding it were ordinary hardware store bolts, the kind you bought by the pound. One corner of the panel had worked loose over the years, probably from road vibration, probably from the slow settling of a vehicle that had not moved under its own power in 3 years. Behind the loose corner was a hollow space, a rectangular void, framed out by hand in a location no factory inspector had ever spec'd, and no mechanic doing a routine check would ever find. Nora reached 2 fingers into the gap and felt past the edge of cold metal, and her fingertips touched something that was not metal. Canvas. Heavy, stiff, oil-treated canvas of the kind used in old firefighting gear. Her fingers closed on the edge of it, and she pulled slow and careful, and the thing shifted toward her heavier than it looked, sliding through the gap with a long scraping sound. It was a turnout bag. A firefighter's gear bag, the old style, the canvas gone dark and rigid with years. A web strap across the top held it closed with a buckle. She set it on her knees and worked the buckle with fingers that were clumsy from the cold, and the strap gave way, and she folded back the flap. The first thing her hand found was a book, not a printed book. A journal, the cover soft leather worn pale at the corners and edges, The pages rippled from being damp and dried more times than she could count. She opened it to the first page and held the flashlight close. The handwriting was square and careful, the handwriting of someone who did not write often, but wanted to get each letter right. At the top of the page was a date from 18 years ago. And below the date, in that same deliberate hand, 7 words, "To the one I carried out." She read it twice. She turned the page and then another, scanning her eyes, catching phrases and losing them again because her hands were not steady. She closed the journal and set it on the seat and reached back into the bag. The next thing was wrapped in a square of waxed cloth, folded over and tied with a length of thin cord. She worked the knot free and opened the cloth in her lap. 3 things lay inside. A photograph, the edges browned, and one corner burned cleanly away. A small band of white plastic, narrow as a finger, the kind a hospital clips around a newborn's wrist. And a leather shield, the front plate from an old fire helmet embossed with a number and a single word. Captain. She picked up the photograph first. A young woman looked back at her, 22 or 23 at most, with dark hair pushed behind one ear and a smile directed at whoever held the camera. The easy, unguarded smile of someone who did not know yet what was coming. One corner of the image was gone, where the fire had taken it. On the back in soft pencil, a single name. Lena. Nora held the photograph for longer than she meant to. The woman had a particular quality to her face, something around the jaw and the set of the eyes, something she could not name but felt she should be able to. She set the photograph down carefully and picked up the plastic bracelet. She held it under the flashlight. The printing had faded to a near ghost, but she could make it out if she tilted the band just right. Baby girl, a weight in pounds and ounces, and a date. Her hands went still. She knew the date. She had written it on forms in waiting rooms in 7 different counties. She had said it to nurses and caseworkers and school administrators and intake clerks at 4 different group homes. It was the one piece of her own history she had always been given without question, because it was the one piece no one could dispute. It was her birthday. She set the bracelet down very carefully on the seat beside the photograph and looked at the bag. Then she reached in one more time. What came out was an envelope, thick with handling, the paper soft along the fold lines. The flap was tucked rather than sealed. On the front, in the same square handwriting from the journal, 3 words. For the girl. She opened it. The flashlight showed her money. Old bills and newer ones together, banded in small bundles with rubber bands gone brittle with age. She counted it because she could not count it. 20s and 50s and a few older bills mixed in more cash than she had ever held at one time in her life. When she finished, her hands were shaking worse than before. A little over $12,000 sat in her lap in the cab of a fire truck in a salvage yard, and she had $7 to her name and a man across town who was one phone call away from making her officially a thief. She sat with it for a long time. She understood exactly how it looked. A girl with nothing run out of her job in her room, found in the dark with a stranger's money in her hands. If anyone walked up on her right now, there was no story she could tell that anyone would believe, because no one had ever believed her story about anything. She could take it. $12,000 could put her on a bus to a city where no one knew her face. It could buy her a year of being a person who got to start clean in a place where the first thing anyone knew about her was not the thing Rex Garrett knew about her. She looked at the thought honestly, the way she tried to look at everything without pretending it was not there. Then she folded the flap back down over the money and reached past the bracelet and the photograph and placed the envelope back inside the bag. She tucked the waxed cloth around the other objects and replaced them beside it. She did not take the money. She had not stolen Rex Garrett's $4,000. She was not going to reach into a dead woman's savings in the dark just because the dark was the only place anyone had left her. Taking it would mean they had been right about her all along. And the one thing she still owned, the only thing, was the knowledge that they were wrong. She kept the journal. She told herself it was so she could find out who the bag belonged to and find a way to return it. That was part of the truth. The other part was that no one had ever written anything down for her before. And even if this was not written for her, she wanted to know what it felt like to read it. She slid the bag back through the gap, pressed the loose corner of the panel back into place, and pushed the seat forward until it covered the seam. The dog watched her do all of it without moving his chin on his paws, his eyes following her hands. "It's not ours," she told him. "We're just keeping it safe." She sat back against the seat and opened the journal to the first page again and held it in the beam of the flashlight. "To the one I carried out." Below the dedication in the same careful hand, a date from 18 years past. And below the date, the first line of the first entry. "I have never kept a record like this. I do not know who I am writing it for. Maybe for the girl when she is grown, if anyone ever allows her to know I existed. We pulled 4 people out of a building on the river flats tonight. 3 I will learn to forget. The 4th I will not forget as long as I live. The 4th was a baby. A young woman handed her out of a second-floor window with the smoke pouring out around her, and I caught her, and I could not go back up for the mother. The floor went before I reached the stair. I can still feel the weight of that baby in my arms. I will feel it when I die." Below the entry, a signature, neat and small and practiced. "Edna Voss, Captain, Station 9. Nora lowered the journal to her lap and sat looking out through the cracked windshield at the dark river and the dark sky above it, the freight train sound fading now into the distance, the yard quiet around her. She had always been told she was found. Found near a fire on the river flats, no identifying information. No next of kin located a ward of the county before she had a name. Found like a coin in a gutter, like something dropped from a pocket, like something that had slipped away from whoever was carrying it. She had built her whole understanding of herself on that word. Found meant no one came back. Found meant no one had been looking. But a baby does not come out of a burning building by accident. Somebody goes in after her. Somebody catches her when she falls. She sat in the cold cab with the journal against her chest, and the dog breathing slow and warm beside her, and the river running dark beyond the fence. And for the first time, she could remember the silence inside her had a shape. Not the flat, empty silence of a person with no history. Something different. Something that had a woman's name written in careful square letters at the bottom of it. She did not sleep for a long time. But when sleep finally came, it came without the usual effort, and it held her steady until the first gray light began to separate the sky from the river, and the yard around her started slowly to wake. She had not slept long. The light was still mostly dark when she woke, the journal still resting across her knees where it had fallen when exhaustion finally took her, and she picked it up and opened it again because sleep had not taken the questions with it. The dog was still warm against her left side. The cold in the cab had deepened in the hours before dawn, and she pulled the jacket tighter and shook the flashlight back to brightness and kept reading. The pages were not easy reading. Cap Voss had not written for an audience. She had written the way a person talks to themselves in the dark, in fragments and repetitions, circling the same few facts again and again. Not because it helped, but because she could not leave them alone. The handwriting stayed square and careful throughout the hand of a woman who did not write often, but believed that if you were going to say a thing, you ought to say it correctly. The first entries were from the night of the fire itself and the days immediately after. Edna Voss had been 59 years old, 2 years from mandatory retirement, 31 years on the job with Station 9, the last 11 as captain. She wrote about the building on the river flats with the precision of someone writing an incident report, noting the smoke pattern and the structural failure and the exact angle of the window where the young woman appeared. Then the precision broke, and what came through underneath was not an officer's account, but a human one. She wrote about catching the baby with both arms and the weight of her and the sound she made, which was screaming, and screaming meant breathing, and breathing meant alive. She wrote about going back to the base of the building after and looking up at the window and understanding that there was no going back up. The floor was already gone. She wrote that sentence once and did not return to it. Some things you only say once. In the weeks after the entries became a different kind of document. Cap Voss had gone to the county hospital twice asking after the infant. Twice they had told her she was not family and therefore not entitled to information. She wrote to the county. She wrote to the State Office of Child Welfare. She hired a lawyer with her savings, a man who took $3,000 of her money, and sent back a letter explaining that a single woman of 59 in a physically hazardous occupation had no realistic path to adoption of an infant already in the state's care. She wrote about sitting in her truck outside the Delwood Children's Home 3 separate times without going in because she did not know what she would say, and she knew that whatever she said would not be enough. I understand the logic of it, she had written in one of the longer entries, the handwriting looser than usual, as though she had written it late and tired. A woman like me is not what they picture when they picture a home. I am not young. I run into burning buildings for a living. I have no husband and no family nearby, and no particular talent for the soft things people expect from mothers. But I keep thinking about the weight of her. People do not understand how light a baby is until they have caught one falling. She weighed nothing. She weighed nothing, and she was screaming, and that screaming was the most complete sound I have ever heard in my life. The state tells me that makes me nobody to her. I do not accept it. I will keep the record. When she is grown, when no one can prevent her from knowing her own history, I want there to be something in the world that says you were carried out. You did not fall. Someone caught you. That is not nothing. That is not nothing at all. Nora sat with that passage for a long time before turning the page. The middle years of the journal were harder to read, not because the writing changed, but because the events did not. The same search running on through year after year, the same walls rising up to meet it. Cap Voss had learned the young woman's name from the fire report. Lena Marsh, 22. No permanent address in Delwood. No family located before or after. The landlord of the building on the river flats had told her that the woman had come up from somewhere south, paid cash, kept to herself, was always polite. No one knew where she was from originally. No one came to identify her. She was buried at county expense in the far corner of the Delwood Municipal Cemetery, in the section reserved for people no one claimed. I found her grave last Tuesday, Cap Voss had written. I go and sit there sometimes. Someone ought to know where she is. She did the bravest thing I have ever seen in 31 years of this work, and she did it in less than 30 seconds, and no one is going to write it in any record that matters. So I am writing it here. She held her baby out of a burning window to a stranger she could not see clearly through the smoke, and she let go. She trusted the stranger to catch. That is an act of faith so complete I do not have a word for it. I will not let her be a name in a file. I will not let her be nobody. Nora looked at the photograph tucked beside her on the seat. Lena, 22 years old with her hair pushed back and a smile for whoever held the camera. A woman who had trusted a stranger in the smoke, and then the floor had gone, and there was nothing after that. Nothing in any record that mattered. She turned back to the journal and kept reading. The later entries were shorter and further apart. Cap Voss retired at 61, stayed in Delwood, lived alone in the house on Carpenter Street she had owned for 20 years. The entries from those years were quieter, more scattered the spaces between thoughts, wider as though she had more time and less urgency. She wrote about the men and women she had worked with and where they had scattered to after the station closed. She wrote about her knees going bad and then her heart going bad, and the particular indignity of a body that had carried you through 31 years of smoke and heat, deciding it was finished without consulting you. She wrote about selling the house when the stairs became impossible and moving into Ridgemont Care Home on the Ridge Road, and how small the room was, and how she did not mind the smallness as much as she had expected to. And she wrote about the truck. They are scrapping the old engine from 9. The handwriting in that entry was shakier than any of the earlier ones, the letters sliding slightly off their lines. They hauled her off the lot behind the old station today. I asked to ride along and they let me. Before she left, I did the last thing I had left to do. I built a space inside her behind the seat where no one would look unless they already knew what they were looking for. I put it all there. The photograph of her mother. The band off her wrist from the night they brought her into the hospital. The money I have been saving all these years that was always meant for her and never for me. I do not have a house anymore to leave anyone. I do not have a name to put on her in any record the state will recognize. But this truck carried her out alive once. Trucks outlast old women both. And if there is any justice left in the world, or any mercy, the girl will find her way back to the one thing that has never forgotten her. I never learned your name, but I have thought about the weight of you every day since the night I set you down. Every single day. Nora closed the journal. She sat for a moment with her eyes shut and her hands flat on the cover and her breathing going carefully in and out. The cold in the cab had gotten into her bones while she was reading, and she had not noticed until now. Dutch shifted beside her and put his chin on her knee, and she put her hand on his head without opening her eyes. It was her. There was no other way to hold it. The fire on the river flats, the date on the bracelet the baby pulled from the second-floor window and handed down to a stranger. She had been told her whole life that she was found. Found near a fire with no identifying information and no next of kin. Found like something lost. But there had been a woman at that window who held her out deliberately, who made a choice in smoke and heat to hand her to a stranger rather than hold on. And there had been a stranger below who caught her and then spent the next 18 years trying to reach her through every door the world would open, which turned out to be none of them. She was not found. She had been carried. Those were entirely different things, and she had spent 18 years not knowing the difference. She sat with it until the sky began to lighten at the edges, and the shapes of the stacked cars in the yard came back slowly out of the dark. She did not hear the footsteps on the gravel until they were close. She went still in the cab, dropping below the window line, one hand on Dutch's back, and the dog went still with her. The footsteps came from the front of the lot, moving along the near row of dead cars, and then stopped somewhere maybe 30 feet away. It was Cole. She could hear his voice low and fast, the voice of a person who had come to the back of the property to be somewhere his father could not hear him. He was on the phone. "I know what I owe," he was saying. "I know the exact number. I just need a few more days to move it. It's being handled and you do not call the house. Whatever else you do not call the house." A pause. He was pacing 2 or 3 steps one way and back. "I'm getting it. The engine was just the start. There's more on that lot I can move, and I've got a line on the buyer, and it'll be square before the end of the month. Just don't call the house." He hung up. She heard him stand there in the gravel breathing, and then he kicked something, the hollow ring of a hubcap skidding away across the ground. Then his footsteps went back toward the front of the lot. Nora sat up slowly. She thought about $4,000 missing from a safe that only 2 men knew the combination to. She thought about a restored engine block that was worth considerably more than $4,000 and was currently somewhere it was not supposed to be. She thought about Cole's jaw in the office yesterday morning and the muscle going in his cheek and the particular direction of his eyes, which was anywhere but at her face. She had known since yesterday morning who had taken Rex Garrett's money. She had just had no way to prove it and no one willing to hear it. She put the journal in the inside pocket of her jacket and sat back to wait out the daylight. Freddie Oaks came at first light. Nora heard her before she saw her, the sound of footsteps that were not in a hurry and the low click of a plastic container lid being worked open. She rose up enough to see over the dash. On the far side of the fence, a woman was crouching down, setting something on the gravel. She was somewhere in her early 60s, broad-shouldered and steady in the manner of someone who had been on their feet for 30 years of long shifts, with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair and a canvas apron showing under an open wool coat. She was unwrapping a piece of foil. Dutch stood up, stepped over Nora's legs, and went to the edge of the cab door. Nora reached past him and eased the door open, and the dog dropped down to the ground and crossed the yard to the fence in a straight line, businesslike, as though this were a scheduled appointment. The woman looked up at the dog and then past the dog and saw Nora standing beside the truck. She did not flinch. She did not reach for a phone. She took Nora's measure with the calm, unhurried attention of a woman who had seen enough in 60-some years that a girl standing alone in a salvage yard before sunrise did not particularly alarm her. "Well," the woman said, "you're new." "I'm sorry," Nora said. "I'll go. I wasn't taking anything." "Didn't say you were." The woman unwrapped the foil the rest of the way. Inside were 2 biscuit sandwiches, egg and something still steaming in the cold air. She broke one in half and pushed a piece through the fence for Dutch and held the other half out toward Nora. You look like you need this worse than he does, and that is genuinely saying something. This dog eats like he's expecting a long winter. Nora looked at the food. Her stomach made the decision before the rest of her caught up. She came to the fence and took the half biscuit and ate it in 4 bites, and then made herself slow down for the second half. The woman watched without comment until she slowed down. Name's Winifred, she said. Freddie, if you have any sense. I run the breakfast counter up on Delwood Road. Have for going on 32 years. She nodded at Dutch on the other side of the fence. I've been bringing that old dog Scraps most mornings since he turned up out here. Because somebody ought to. She looked at Nora directly. What's your name and why are you sleeping in Rex Garrett's yard in November? Nora almost lied. The lie was right there, small and easy, and there was nothing this woman could do with the truth except make things harder. But Freddie had pushed half her breakfast through a fence without being asked, and had not required anything in exchange, and Nora was tired in a way that had gotten into her before the bones tired in the manner that makes honesty easier than the alternative. Because at least honesty doesn't require you to keep track of anything. Nora, she said, I worked for Rex. He thinks I stole from him. I didn't, but it doesn't matter what I say. Freddie nodded, slow and unsurprised. Heard something about that yesterday. Town this size, you hear everything by supper time, whether you want to or not. She studied Nora's face. You sleep all right out here? Well enough. Freddie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You know how I can tell you didn't take that man's money? Nora waited. Nobody carrying a guilty conscience sleeps that still. She gestured toward the truck. You came out of that cab like someone who's just tired of being blamed. That's a different kind of still entirely. Nora did not have an answer for that. It had been a long time since anyone had said something precise and kind about her, and she had to look down at the ground to keep her face where she wanted it. Freddie pushed the second sandwich through the fence. Eat the rest of this. Then she said more quietly, the deputy's cruiser came up the access road yesterday afternoon while Rex was still giving his statement. They'll be looking for you in daylight. I know it. You can't stand out here where the road can see you. I know that too. I just don't have anywhere else. Freddie pressed her lips together, thinking. All right, she said finally. You stay back of this lot. By that truck away from the road. Nobody comes back this far but the dog, and apparently now you. I open at 6 and I'm done by 2, and I'll bring something hot at mid-morning. She paused. You got a coat any heavier than that? No. I'll bring one of those too. She started to turn, then stopped. She looked at Nora through the fence with an expression that was not quite pity and landed somewhere harder to name. That dog, she said. He didn't take to anybody at this yard. Rex couldn't get near him. Says something a dog choosing a person. They know things we're not paying enough attention to find out ourselves. She went back up the road and Nora took the coffee she had left and went back to the truck to wait out the daylight. She spent the morning low in the cab with the windows fogged. Rex's voice carried across the lot from the front, and once Cole's voice higher and faster. A parts delivery came and went. Around mid-morning, a deputy's cruiser rolled slowly up the access road, paused at the gate for a minute, then backed out and left. Nora watched it through the fog glass and did not breathe right until the dust settled. She took the journal out and read the passages she had already read again more slowly this time, as though reading them slowly might make them feel more real. A woman named Edna Voss, 60-some years old now at least. She thought about the entry where Cap Voss had written about the care home on the Ridge Road, and she sat with the arithmetic of it. Not dead. The journal did not say she was dead. The journal said she had moved to Ridgemont Care Home when the stairs in her house became impossible. That could have been years ago. That could have been recently. That could mean she was still there. She had been sitting with this thought, not quite letting herself think it all the way through for most of the morning when Freddie came back at mid-morning as promised, with a container of soup and a heavy flannel-lined canvas jacket and a pair of wool socks still in the wrapper. Nora climbed down from the cab and came to the fence. Freddie passed everything through and Nora put the jacket on over her own, and the warmth of it was so immediate and complete that she had to stand still for a moment and simply let it happen. She ate the soup standing up. Freddie watched her and waited with the patience of a woman who was used to people needing a moment before they could talk. When the container was empty, Nora reached into her jacket and brought out the journal. She held it through the fence. Freddie took it and opened it to the first page and read. Her lips moved slightly. She turned a few pages and read again, and then she stopped and looked up. "That's Cap Voss's writing," she said. Her voice had changed, gone quieter and more careful. "That's Edna Voss's hand. I'd know it anywhere. You know her." It was not a question, but Freddie answered it like one. Know her. Freddie gave a short sound that was something between a laugh and something else entirely. Edna Voss ate breakfast at my counter every single morning for 30 years. Black coffee, 2 eggs, wheat toast, same tip every time to the penny, because she told me once that a person ought to be predictable in the small things, so they have something left over for the big ones. She lowered the journal. Paid for other people's breakfast when she thought I wasn't looking. I was always looking. She shook her head. Good woman. Best kind of officer I ever saw, and I've fed a lot of them over the years. The good ones all do the same thing. They spend their whole lives running toward whatever everybody else is running from, and then they act embarrassed when you try to thank them for it. Freddie, Nora said. Is she alive? Freddie went still. Is Captain Voss still alive? Freddie looked at her for a moment. Then she said, Honey Cap Voss is not dead. She's up at Ridgemont Care Home on the Ridge Road. She has been for the last 3 years. I sent her a slice of pie at Thanksgiving. She looked at Nora's face, and her own face changed as the full weight of it arrived all at once. Son of a gun, she said softly. Son of a gun. She's 2 miles away, Nora said. 2 miles up the Ridge Road. Nora stood very still. 18 years. 2 miles. The distance between them had been 2 miles this entire time, and no road in the world had been built between those 2 points. Her mind is not what it was, Freddie said carefully. Some days she's as sharp as she ever was. Other days she's back at the station, back in a fire that's been out for decades. You have to be ready for either one. Nora nodded. She already knew what she was going to do. She had known it since the moment Freddie said not dead, had felt the whole shape of it click into place, the same way a mechanism clicks when you finally find the right configuration. There's something else, Freddie said. Her voice shifted, taking on the quality of a person bracing to deliver bad news to someone who has already had enough. 2 things, and I'm sorry for both of them. Tell me. First, there's a man over in Harker County been talking at the feed store about a restored engine block he bought off a young fellow cash, no paperwork. Good deal, he said. Almost too good. People in town are starting to do the math on that out loud. The 327, Nora said. Cole sold it. Looks that way. The truth is working itself loose. But truth works slow sometimes, and this particular truth is not loose yet. And the second thing, Freddie's jaw set. Rex got a call yesterday afternoon from his steel buyer. Buyer's schedule changed. They moved the pickup up. She looked at Nora directly. They're crushing that truck tomorrow morning. First thing. The yard was very quiet around them. Dutch sat between Nora and the fence and looked up at her with his patient gray muzzled face. 3 days had become one. Nora turned and looked at the fire engine in the back corner of the lot, the red paint dull in the flat morning light, the chrome bell on the front bumper, the cracked windshield she had looked out of all night. The engine that had been sitting in this yard for 3 years, waiting for the crusher with $12,000 and a photograph and a hospital bracelet and a dead woman's name sealed up behind the seat. She thought about Edna Voss writing in that last entry that she had prayed the girl would find her way back to the one thing that had never forgotten her. She thought about the fact that the one thing was going to be a cube of compressed steel by tomorrow afternoon. She reached through the fence and picked up the journal from Freddie's hands and tucked it back inside her jacket. I'm not waiting for the law to sort out Cole Garrett, she said. That could take a week, and that truck is gone tomorrow morning. She looked at Freddie. I need you to drive me up to Ridgemont. Freddie looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded once with the decisive compression of a woman who had already made up her mind and was just waiting for someone to say the thing out loud. I need to go back and get Loretta to cover the counter, she said. Give me 20 minutes. She was already turning. Bring that dog if he'll come with you. She paused without turning around. Cap always loved that dog. Dutch came. He walked at Nora's heel through the gap in the fence and along the road's shoulder to the small gravel lot behind Freddie's counter, where a 10-year-old Subaru sat with a cracked rear taillight and a bumper sticker from a state park Nora had never been to. Freddie came out the back door of the diner, pulling her coat straight, and tossed her the keys without ceremony. You navigate, I drive. I know where Ridgemont is, but I need my hands on the wheel and my eyes on the road, so you talk me through if I miss the turn. They drove the ridge road with the heater going and Dutch's chin on the console between the seats. The town went by on either side: the hardware store, the library where Nora had been on the night Cole was at the safe, the corner where the sheriff's office sat with its flag at half-mast for something she had not followed. She kept her face turned slightly away from the windows and watched for a cruiser in the mirror, and none came. Mind her heart, Freddie said as she eased off the gas for the turn up the ridge. The care home nurses told me her pump is not strong. Any kind of shock can scatter her for a whole day. Nora looked out the window. What do I say to her? Show her the bracelet first, before anything else. Let her hold it. Her hands will know before her head catches up. And if her mind's not there today, then you tell her anyway. Freddie kept her eyes on the road. You tell her the river carried it back. Some part of her will hear you. That part always does, no matter where the rest of her is gone. Ridgemont Care Home sat back from the ridge road behind a half-circle of bare-branched oaks, a long, low brick building with a flagpole and a covered porch with 6 rocking chairs that no one had sat in since September. Freddie pulled into the lot and cut the engine, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Nora had her hand on the door handle. Her pulse was doing something she had not felt in a long time, a fast, shallow percussion that was not quite fear and not quite anything else she had a word for. What if she doesn't know what I'm talking about, she said. What if I get in there and she's back somewhere I can't reach her? Then you tell her anyway, Freddie said again. She reached over and pressed Nora's arm once quick and firm. Now go. She's been waiting on you a lot longer than you've been waiting on her. Nora got out of the car. The cold air was sharper up on the ridge, thinner and cleaner than down in the flats. The gravel under her boots made the same sound it made in the salvage yard. She climbed the steps to the glass doors, and Dutch came up behind her, and she pushed through into the warmth. The lobby was bright and smelled of floor wax and coffee, and something institutional and not unpleasant underneath. A woman at the front desk looked up. She looked at Dutch and then at Nora without particular alarm. I'm here to see Edna Voss, Nora said. The woman at the desk smiled. Cap's in the sunroom, down the hall, last door on the left. She's having a good morning. She paused, taking in the duffel on Nora's shoulder and the worn jacket underneath the borrowed one. Are you family? Nora opened her mouth. The word no was right there, technically accurate. The word she had said on every form in every waiting room in her entire life. Then she thought about the journal in her jacket and the bracelet in her pocket and the woman who had ridden along when the truck was hauled to the salvage yard so that she could seal a record inside it on the chance that the right person would someday find their way there. I think I might be, she said. The sunroom was a long, bright space with windows on 3 sides and plants in the sills, and several residents in chairs with various degrees of wakefulness. At the far end in a wheelchair, angled toward the south-facing windows, sat an old woman with a blanket over her knees and her hands folded in her lap. She was thin in the manner of people whose frames were once much larger, the architecture of a bigger person, still visible in the width of her shoulders and the set of her jaw. Her hair was white and cut short and practical. She sat very straight. Dutch went ahead. His claws clicked on the tile and he crossed the room in a straight line and stopped at the woman's chair and placed his gray muzzle on her knee. The old woman's hands unfolded. One of them came down slowly onto the dog's head, finding the shape of his ears by feel, and she went very still. Her fingers moved through the fur in a gesture that was not new. That was old. That was the gesture of a hand that had done this particular thing 1,000 times. She bent forward over the dog's muzzle and her voice came out thick and low. "Dutch," she said, "you remember me. They wouldn't let me bring you. No dogs, they said." She worked the loose skin at the back of his neck. "You rode the back step with us your last few years. Best nose on any crew I ever ran." She wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand and then seemed to remember herself, and she looked up. Her eyes were a faded blue, the color of sky in an old photograph, and they found Nora's face and held there with the careful, polite attention of a woman who had learned to cover for the gaps in her own memory. "Forgive me," she said. "I don't quite place you." Nora's hands were not steady. She reached into her jacket pocket and took out the small plastic bracelet, the hospital band with the faded printing, and the date she had known her whole life. She crossed the last few feet of tile between them, and without a word she held it out and placed it in the old woman's open palm. Edna Voss looked down at it. The room was very quiet. Dutch had settled with his chin still on her knee and his eyes half closed. A long moment passed. Then the old woman's thumb moved across the printing on the bracelet. Slowly. Reading it the manner someone reads in the dark when they have to use their fingers. And her face changed. The careful social surface that a person assembles when their memory is unreliable fell away all at once, and what was underneath it was not confusion. It was a grief that had been sitting in the same place for 18 years and had not moved an inch. "Where did you get this?" she said. Her voice had gone to almost nothing. "I put this away. I put this somewhere no one would ever." Her head came up. Her eyes were on Nora's face now, and they were not searching for recognition anymore. They were simply looking with a directness that had nothing careful about it. "It was behind the seat," Nora said. "In the truck. I found the bag, the journal, the money, her picture." She reached into her jacket and brought out the photograph and held it where the old woman could see it. Lena, the dark hair pushed back, the smile, the burned corner. Edna Voss took the photograph in her free hand and looked at the young woman in it, and her eyes filled and spilled over without any effort to stop them. "I went and sat by her grave," she said, "so someone would know where she was." She looked from the photograph to Nora's face and back again, and then she stopped. "You've got her chin," she said. "Lord have mercy, girl. You've got Lena's exact chin." Nora's throat had closed. She lowered herself to one knee beside the wheelchair so that they were level with each other, so that there was nothing between them but the small space of air that two people occupy when they are finally in the same room after a very long time. "It was me, Cap," she said. "The date on the band is my birthday. I was the baby you carried out. I grew up in the system. They always told me I was found near a fire and no one knew who I was." She stopped, started again. "It was me. You've been writing to me. All of it. It was me." Edna Voss reached out one hand and laid it against the side of Nora's face. The palm was rough and cool, the hand of someone who had spent decades in gloves that were never quite enough, and it settled against her cheek with a steadiness that nothing in the room could have disturbed. "I held you," the old woman said. "You weighed nothing. You were screaming, which was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard, because screaming meant you were breathing. Your mother got the window open and the smoke was coming around her, and she leaned out and she said, 'Take her. Just take her.' And I had my arms up and she let you go and I caught you." She stopped. Her jaw worked. And then she said one more thing. She said, "Her name is." And the floor went, and I never heard the rest. I have wondered every single day of my life what that last word was. Nora sat on the floor of the sunroom with her back against the side of the wheelchair, and the old woman's hand on her head, and the dog pressed warm against her legs. And for the first time in her life, the silence inside her was not empty. It had a shape. It had a woman's hands in it, rough and steady and still. She reached into her jacket one more time and brought out the journal and held it in her lap. She opened it to the last page, the one with the shakiest handwriting, dated only 2 years ago. She had tried to read it the night before, in the dark of the cab, had tilted the flashlight across it twice, and taken it for nearly blank. the water stain the same near black as the surrounding dark. Now in the clear winter light of the sunroom, she could see it properly. The words at the bottom of the page were written in a hand much less controlled than the earlier entries, the letters listing slightly, the lines uneven. She tilted the page and read them carefully. I think she said her name Cap Voss had written. Right before the floor went. I think I heard it after all. I think she said, and then the page ended. The next word was obscured by a dark water stain that had bloomed across the lower corner of the page and dried there years ago, turning the paper the color of old tea. Nora looked at it for a long moment. She tilted the journal toward the south window, and the winter sun fell across the page at a different angle, and the shadow shifted, and the letters under the stain emerged from it like something surfacing from deep water. 3 letters. A name. She turned the journal so Edna Voss could see it. The old woman looked at the page. Then she looked at Nora. Then she closed her eyes. I heard it, she said. I heard it, and I didn't know what it was. I thought she was saying something else. Her voice was very quiet now. Her hand pressed once against Nora's hair. All this time. She said it plain as anything, and I just didn't know it was a name. Nora sat very still. Outside the south windows, the ridge fell away toward the town below, and somewhere down there in the river flats, a building had burned 18 years ago. On a cold night, and a young woman had held a baby out of a window to a stranger she could not see and set her daughter's name into the smoke and let go. Her name had been Nora. It had always been Nora. It had been her name before she had anything else, before the county gave her a file number and a social worker and a last name pulled from the geography of where she was found. She had been named before the floor went. She had been somebody's daughter before she was anybody's case. The sunroom was very quiet. Dutch breathed steadily against her legs. Edna Voss's hand rested on her hair, still and warm. And Nora sat on the floor with the journal open in her lap and let the knowledge of it move through her like water finding its level, slow and certain, and without any drama at all. Then Freddie appeared in the doorway of the sunroom with her coat still on and her face carefully neutral and her eyes bright. She caught Nora's eye and held up 2 fingers. 2 things she said from the doorway, keeping her voice low and steady. She held up 1 finger. The man with the engine block. He drove into Delwood this morning, walked into the sheriff's office with a bill of sale and a phone full of text messages. Messages from Cole setting up the deal. Dates, dollar amounts, pictures of the engine, the 2nd finger. And Rex moved the crusher up again. She looked at Nora steadily. They're running it at first light tomorrow. Not mid-morning. First light. Edna Voss had been listening. Nora felt the old woman's hand tighten slightly against her hair and then release. Then Cap said in a voice that had recovered most of its steadiness, that truck carried 4 people out of a burning building the night of the River Flats fire. 4 people and a dog if you count Dutch, which I do. She put both hands on the arms of the wheelchair and pushed herself up to sitting as straight as she could manage. Get my coat, she said. We are going down there. That engine is not going into a crusher while I'm still drawing breath in this county. She looked at Nora with the faded blue eyes that had seen 31 years of fires and had not looked away from any of them. What happens to that truck tomorrow is your call to make, she said. Not mine, but I will be standing right next to you when you make it. Nora stood up from the floor. She put the journal in her jacket. She put the bracelet in her pocket. She looked at the old woman in the wheelchair, at the straight back, and the set jaw, and the rough, steady hands, and she felt something shift in her chest. Not breaking, not the way things had always broken before, but the way ice shifts in the first warmth of a thaw, slow and inevitable, and without any going back. She had come into this room with $7 in a stranger's journal and 18 years of being no one's. She was leaving with something else entirely. She reached down and took the handles of the wheelchair. Cap, she said, let's go get the truck. Freddie drove back down the ridge road with both hands on the wheel and the heater running and nobody talking much. Dutch sat between the front seats with his chin on the console. Edna Voss sat in the back with her old captain's shield in her lap, the leather worn pale at the edges, the stamped letters catching the weak afternoon light. She held it the manner you hold something you earned rather than something you were given, with a flatness of the palms that meant she was not thinking about it consciously. It was just where her hands went. Nora watched the town come up through the windshield and thought about what she was going to do. She had until first light. The crusher was booked and Rex had a contract and a steel buyer and a financial situation that had apparently been worse than anyone outside that single wide trailer had known. A man drowning in his own debt does not stop a machine to accommodate someone else's feelings, not even if that someone else is an 18-year-old girl who has just found out the machine is the only physical record that she was ever worth saving. The world did not work that way, and she had known since she was 9 years old that waiting for the world to work a different way was the longest wait there was. She was not going to wait. She had one thing she needed to do before morning, and she needed to do it alone. Freddie pulled into the lot behind her counter and cut the engine. She turned halfway around in the seat and looked at Nora with the expression of a woman who already knew some part of what was coming and was deciding how much to say about it. "You're going back in there tonight," Freddie said. It was not a question. "I need to get the bag out before the machine touches that truck," Nora said. "If they crush it with everything still inside, it's gone. The money, the photograph, the bracelet, all of it." Freddie looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "You be careful about Cole. Rex threw him off the property this afternoon when the deputy came out about the engine block. He's got nowhere to go, and a man with nowhere to go and a debt he can't pay does things he wouldn't otherwise do. I know it." "I mean it, Nora. I know you mean it." Edna Voss spoke from the back seat. Her voice was quiet, but it had not lost any of its precision. "You go in, you get what belongs to you, and you come back out." She paused. "That money was always meant for you. Every dollar of it. I want you to understand that before you go in there, thinking you're taking something that doesn't belong to you. It belongs to you. It has belonged to you for 18 years. Nora looked back at her. In the gray afternoon light, the old woman's face was very clear. The lines of it deep and settled, the eyes direct, and without any of the cloudiness that came and went depending on the day. This was one of the sharp days. This was Cap Voss as she had been for 31 years of running toward smoke. And Nora held that image carefully because she did not know how many more of these days there would be. "I'll be back before it's fully dark," she said. She went in through the gap in the fence the same way she had gone in the night before, on her belly in the cold with the duffel pushed through ahead of her. The yard was quiet. Rex's truck was at the front of the property, but the lights in the office trailer were off, and she could not tell from the back lot whether he was inside or gone home. She moved along the row of stacked cars, staying low in the shadow of the metal, the manner she had learned to move through spaces where she was not supposed to be, which was a skill she had developed young and had never been able to entirely set down. The fire engine sat where it had always sat, in the far back corner against the fence, the red paint going black in the low light. She came around the front and put her hand on the chrome bell, the same automatic way she had made 100 times over 2 years without knowing why. The metal was cold and solid under her palm. She stood there a moment with her hand on it. Then she climbed up into the cab. The seat slid back on its track, the same as the night before. The panel in the rear wall was right where she had left it, one corner loose, the bolt threads worn smooth from years of vibration. She reached in and her fingers found the canvas strap of the bag, and she pulled it through the gap and lifted it into her lap. She sat in the cab for a moment with the bag on her knees. The river was dark beyond the fence, the same river it had always been running past the same flats where a building had burned on a cold night 18 years ago. She thought about Edna Voss sitting in the seat on the day the truck was hauled away from Station 9, building a hiding place by hand with hardware store bolts and a sheet of cut steel sealing a record inside the one thing she had left to leave behind. She thought about Lena at a second-floor window with the smoke coming around her. She lifted the bag and climbed down from the cab. She was crossing back through the center of the lot, moving between 2 rows of stacked cars, when she heard him. Cole was at the edge of the back lot near the old parts shelving that ran along the east fence. He had not heard her yet. He was standing with his back to her, looking at his phone, the screen lighting his face from below. He had not gone far when Rex threw him out. He had just gone to the one part of the property where his father rarely came. She could go back the other way, the long way around along the west fence, and he might not see her at all. She stood still in the shadow of the stacked cars and thought about that for the length of one slow breath. Then she stepped out of the shadow and kept walking toward the gap in the fence, and Cole turned at the sound of her boots on the gravel and saw her. His face went through several things very quickly. Surprise first, then something that was almost relief and then was not, and then a hardness that settled over the top of everything else like a lid coming down. "What are you doing in here?" he said. "Same thing you are," she said. "Standing in a place I don't particularly belong." She did not stop walking. She kept her pace steady and her eyes forward and the bag at her side. Cole moved to put himself in her path. Not aggressive exactly, but deliberate. He was taller than her by 6 inches and broader by a margin that was meant to register, and in other circumstances it would have. She had spent enough of her life in the company of people who used their size to communicate what they were not saying out loud, to know exactly what this posture meant. She stopped. She looked at him directly without moving her eyes to the side or adjusting her weight or doing any of the things the body wants to do when it is calculating exits. She had learned a long time ago that the looking away was the part that cost you. "You took what was in that safe," she said. "You took the engine block too, and you sold it to a man in Harker County, and you have been letting your father believe I did it." She said it without heat, the manner you state a measurement. "This is the dimension. This is what the thing is." Cole's jaw tightened. "You don't know anything about what I did. The man you sold that engine to walked into the sheriff's office this morning with a bill of sale and a phone full of your text messages." She watched his face. He had dollar amounts and dates and photographs of the engine with your number in the metadata. She paused. "By tomorrow morning, there will not be a person in this county who doesn't know exactly what you took and who you took it from." The hardness in his face shifted. Something underneath it moved, not guilt exactly, not yet, but the first tremor of a structure that had been built on the assumption that the ground beneath it was stable. "You need to go home and call a lawyer," she said. "That's the most useful thing I can tell you." She stepped around him. He did not reach for her. He did not say anything else. She heard him behind her, standing in the gravel, and then she was through the gap in the fence and on the roadside, and she did not look back. She walked to Freddie's counter and found Freddie waiting in the car with the engine running and the heater going. Dutch was in the back seat now, pressed against Edna Voss's knee, and the old woman had her hand in his fur and her eyes on the road. "I got it," Nora said, climbing in and setting the bag on her lap. "Nobody gave you trouble," Freddie said. Cole was there. Freddie's hands tightened on the wheel. "And I told him what I knew." Nora looked out the window at the dark road. "The rest of it is his to figure out." Freddie drove. For a while, no one spoke. Then Edna Voss said from the back seat, with the precise timing of someone who has been waiting for exactly the right moment, "I want to hear everything that happened to you. Not tonight, because tonight you both need to sleep. But soon. All of it. Every house and every school and every person who looked at you and decided wrong. I want to hear all of it." Nora kept her eyes on the window. "Okay," she said. "That's all. Just okay." "That's enough," Cap said. Freddie drove them back up the ridge road and got Edna Voss settled for the night, talking to the duty nurse with the no-nonsense efficiency of a woman who had been navigating other people's institutional systems on their behalf for 30 years. Nora sat in the sunroom while they handled the paperwork of it, the bag in her lap, Dutch at her feet, the dark valley spread out below the south windows. She took the photograph out of the bag one more time and looked at Lena in the low light of the sunroom. 22 years old. The burned corner. The easy smile. A woman who had not known yet what was coming, and then had known and had done the one thing there was to do with the knowing. She put the photograph carefully back in the wax cloth. She folded it the way it had been folded before. She did not know yet what the right thing to do with it was, but she knew it was not to leave it in a salvage yard. Freddie came back and drove her down the ridge and let her sleep on the narrow couch in the back room of the counter behind the kitchen with a blanket that smelled of the diner and Dutch curled on the floor beside her. She lay on her back in the dark and listened to the dog breathe and thought about first light. She slept. She woke before the alarm she had not set the same as always and lay still for a moment looking at the ceiling, and then she got up. It was not yet 5. Freddie was already in the kitchen. The manner people who have run a breakfast counter for 32 years are always already in the kitchen, and she looked at Nora once and handed her a travel cup of coffee without being asked. "They're going to run it at 6, Freddie said. Rex booked the operator for 6 sharp. Nora nodded. She drank the coffee standing up. "Is she ready?" she said. Freddie smiled, small and certain. "Cap Voss has been ready for this for 18 years. They drove to Ridgemont in the dark and found Edna Voss already in her coat, already in her chair, the leather captain's shield in her lap. The night nurse on duty looked at Freddie with the expression of a person who knew that some arguments were not worth having and handed over a waiver form for off-site visits. Freddie signed it. They were back in the car by 5:20. The 4 of them and Dutch on the floorboard drove down the ridge road in the last of the dark, with the heater running and the valley below just beginning to separate itself from the sky. The first light was a line of gray at the eastern edge, not warmth yet, just the idea of it. Nora sat in the passenger seat with the canvas bag between her feet and the journal inside her jacket, and her hands quiet in her lap. She was not shaking. She had been shaking off and on since she climbed out of that cab yesterday morning, and she seemed to have used up the shaking somewhere in the night. When they turned in at the gate of Garrett's salvage yard, the floodlights were already on, harsh white light flooding the front lot and the rows of cars. The big diesel of the excavator was running a low, sustained roar that she felt in her chest before she heard it clearly. Freddie pulled in through the gate and stopped. Rex was at the controls of the crusher on the far side of the lot, a panel of levers and gauges in a shed attached to the machine. 2 men she did not know were near the excavator itself, ground crew here for the morning's work. And the excavator operator was already in the cab, the long yellow arm swinging slowly over the back of the lot. Over the roof of a stacked sedan, she could see the top of the fire engine's cab. Red paint in the white light. The excavator arm descended. She was out of the car before Freddie finished stopping. She ran. The gravel was frozen, and her boots found the solid ground underneath the frost. And she ran across the lot, the manner she had run to reach things her whole life. Not with panic, but with a focus that narrowed the world to a single point. She could see the steel grapple at the end of the excavator arm opening, spreading its 4 curved fingers, lowering toward the frame of the truck. She came through the gap between 2 rows of cars and into the open ground behind the lot, and she stopped. She did not wave her arms. She did not shout Cole's name or Rex's name or any name at all. She stood in the open ground between the excavator and the crusher, and she put her hand up, palm out, and she looked at the operator in the cab of the excavator. The operator saw her. The arm hesitated. The grapple held where it was. Rex came out of the crusher shed. He had seen her from across the lot, had seen her run from the car, and now he was crossing toward her with his hands out to his sides, in the posture of a man who has already decided this is not going to go the direction the other person wants it to go. "Nora," he said, "this is a contracted job. You cannot be on this property." She turned to face him. She was standing in the open ground between the machine and the truck, and she did not move out of that position. "That truck," she said, "is the only proof in the world that I was carried out of something instead of dropped into it." She kept her voice level and direct, the voice she used when she was diagnosing a problem, clear and without decoration. "You crush it. You crush the only record that says I was ever worth saving." Rex stopped walking. He looked at her. His face in the floodlight was tired and older than she had ever seen it, the face of a man who had been wrong about something and had known it since yesterday afternoon, and had not yet found a way to put that knowledge down. "I don't know what that means," he said. "There is a hiding place behind the seat of that truck," she said. "A woman built it by hand and sealed a record inside it before the truck came here. A record of who I am and where I came from and why I matter to someone. She spent 18 years trying to reach me, and that truck is the only place any of it still exists. She looked at him steadily. Your son took your money and your engine and blamed it on me, and you believed him because believing him was easier than what the other option meant. I'm not asking you to feel good about that. I'm asking you to give me 60 seconds before you run that machine. Rex stood in the gravel with the excavator idling behind her and the white floodlights overhead and the first gray of dawn coming up over the ridge. He looked past her, then at the car by the gate, at Freddie standing beside it with her arms crossed and her chin set, and at the woman in the wheelchair beside the car, small in her winter coat, the leather shield in her lap, sitting very straight in the manner of someone who has not finished yet. Rex had lived in Delwood his whole life. He had eaten at Freddie's counter. He knew whose chair that was and what it meant that she was sitting in it at 6 in the morning outside his gate with a captain's shield in her lap. He looked back at Nora. Something in his face moved. Not broke exactly, shifted. The manner heavy things shift when the ground underneath them finally settles after a long time of holding on. He turned and looked at the excavator operator in the cab and raised one hand. The arm came down, slowly with the deliberate care of the heavy machinery being asked to do something gentle. The excavator lowered the fire engine back to the gravel. The grapple released. The arm retracted. The diesel dropped to idle. The truck sat in the gravel in the white light with its red paint and its chrome bell and its cracked windshield, the same as it had always sat. And for a moment, no one in the yard said anything at all. Then the cruiser came through the gate. Two of them actually pulling in one behind the other, and behind them, a civilian truck that Nora recognized as belonging to a man she had never met, but whose name she knew the man from Harker County with the bill of sale and the text messages and the photographs. The deputy who got out of the first cruiser was the same one who had rolled slowly up the access road 2 days ago and paused at the gate and left. He walked past Rex without looking at him, and he kept walking until he reached Cole, who had come in from the side lot at the sound of the cruisers and was standing near the row of stacked sedans with his hands in his jacket pockets and his face already doing the thing it had been doing in his father's office 2 days ago. The jaw set and the muscle in the cheek and the eyes that would not land on any face directly. The deputy said Cole's name. Cole took his hands out of his pockets. Rex stood in the open ground of his own yard and watched his son walk to the cruiser with his hands behind his back, and he did not say anything. His face had gone past tired into something that had no easy name. The face of a man watching the thing he built with his own hands come apart at a seam he knew was always going to go eventually. Nora watched it happen and felt nothing she could have predicted. Not satisfaction. Not the release she might have expected after 2 days of carrying the weight of it. Something quieter. The simple factual end of a thing that had been wrong and was now being corrected with the flat, unemotional quality of a mechanism returning to its proper alignment. Freddie was beside her then, one hand on her shoulder, warm and solid, and not saying anything because there was nothing to say. Rex walked toward Nora. He walked slowly, and his hands were at his sides. And when he stopped in front of her, he looked at her with an expression that had nothing left in it, that was defensive or decided. He was just looking at her. "You told me," he said. "You told me straight to my face, and I didn't listen." "Yeah," she said. "I did." He reached into his jacket and brought out an envelope and held it out. It was not thin. She took it without looking inside it, and she did not say thank you, and she did not say it was all right, because it was not all right, and they both knew it, and saying otherwise would have been a kindness neither of them had earned yet. She put the envelope in her jacket pocket. "I'm sorry," Rex said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I know you are." She turned and walked back toward the gate. She pushed Edna Voss's chair through the gate herself, and they went together to where the fire engine sat in the back of the lot in the gravel in the growing light. Freddie and Dutch came behind them. The excavator had gone quiet. The work crew had gathered near their truck, waiting uncertain about the shape of the morning, now that it had become something other than what they were contracted for. Nora stopped the chair beside the front of the truck. She reached out and put her hand on the chrome bell. Edna Voss reached up from the chair and put her hand on top of Nora's. "This truck pulled 4 people out of the river flats," Firecap said. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the red flank of the engine, the instrument of 31 years. Your mother handed you down from that window, and I caught you at the bottom, and we carried you out on this truck. That is the whole of it. You were carried. You were always carried. Nora looked at the bell under their hands. She thought about a woman she would never meet, 22 years old at a second-floor window, holding a baby out into the smoke and trusting a stranger below to catch her. She thought about the weight of that trust, how it had traveled through 18 years without arriving, and how it had arrived now here in a salvage yard in the early morning, with frost on the gravel and a freight train working somewhere far beyond the river. She was named, she thought. Before anything else, she was named. The envelope Rex had given her turned out to contain $400 more than it should have, which was his way of saying what he could not say with language. She counted it once and put it back. The bag came out of the truck properly, this time in daylight, with both hands, and she carried it to the car and set it on the back seat beside Edna Voss. The old woman put her hand on it without opening it, just resting her palm on the canvas, and did not say anything. What comes after a thing like that is quieter than you expect. There is no orchestra for the moment when the wrong thing is finally corrected. The morning just continues. The light keeps coming up. The frost on the gravel keeps catching it and giving it back in pieces. Freddie drove them back up the ridge road. They sat with Cap for the rest of the morning in the sunroom. The four of them and a nurse brought coffee and did not comment on the dog. Cap was sharp all morning, sharper than Freddie said she usually was, as though something in her had been waiting for this day and had been holding itself in reserve against it. Nora told her everything. She told her about the first house and the second house and the 11 houses after that. She told her about the school in Morrow County, where a teacher had told her she tested well for a kid in her situation, which had been meant as a compliment. She told her about the library in Delwood and the engine diagrams she had copied by hand because she was not allowed to take the reference books home. She told her about Rex's yard and the 2 years of early mornings and the cracked watch and what she had been trying to prove with all of it. Cap listened without interrupting. When Nora got to the part about the office and Rex and the keys placed on the desk, the old woman's face went hard in a way that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with a quality she had spent 31 years honing the face of a person who makes decisions in smoke and does not have the luxury of being wrong. You put those keys down careful, Cap said. I did. I know you did. She nodded once. That's the whole of a person's character right there. What they do with their hands when someone takes something from them unjustly. She looked at Nora steadily. Your mother did the same thing. She held you out that window steady as a woman setting down something precious. Not throwing, not dropping. Steady. Nora sat with that for a long time. In the early afternoon, while Cap slept, Nora went and found the duty administrator and asked about the process for establishing next of kin status for a resident. The administrator was a careful woman who chose her words with the precision of someone who had navigated these conversations before. She explained that there were several pathways depending on the nature of the relationship, that a family law attorney would be the appropriate first step, and that Ridgemont was happy to facilitate introductions with the social services office that handled these matters if that would be helpful. Nora said it would be helpful. She said it with the same steadiness she had used when she set the keys on Rex's desk, and the administrator seemed to understand from the quality of it that this was not a casual inquiry. Dutch stayed at Ridgemont that afternoon. The duty nurse, after a brief consultation with the administrator, decided that the existing policy against animals might benefit from a case-by-case review, and that in this particular case the review could begin immediately. Dutch settled on the floor of Cap's room and put his chin on the edge of the bed and stayed there, and his breathing was slow and regular, and Cap's hand found his ear in her sleep without her having to look for it. Nora walked down the ridge road in the early afternoon with the canvas bag over one shoulder. She walked past Freddie's counter and waved through the window, and Freddie waved back without stopping what she was doing, which was exactly right. She walked to the library, which was open, and she sat at one of the long tables in the reference section, and she opened the envelope Rex had given her and counted it again and put it together with the money from the canvas bag, and sat for a moment looking at what it added up to. More than she had ever held, more than she had ever expected to hold. Not a fortune in any sense that the word is usually meant, but enough. Enough for the beginning of something real. She took out the journal and the photograph in the small plastic bracelet and laid them on the table in front of her. The librarian at the reference desk glanced over once and looked away, respecting the privacy of whatever was happening at the corner table with the girl and the old canvas bag. Nora picked up the photograph. Lena, 22, with the burned corner and the easy smile. A woman who had come up from somewhere south with a baby and no ring and no people anyone could find. Who had paid her rent in cash and kept to herself and been always polite. Who had trusted a stranger in the smoke, and then the floor had gone. She thought about what Cap had said about the cemetery, the corner section for people no one claimed. She put the photograph carefully back in the wax cloth and folded it the way it had been folded before, and tied the cord the way it had been tied before. She put everything back in the bag. She sat there for a while longer in the quiet of the reference section, with the afternoon light coming through the windows and the familiar smell of books around her, and the watch on her wrist showing the right time. And she thought about what it meant to know where you came from. Not the geography of it, not the fire report, and the county file, and the social worker's notation. The other thing, the thing that lived underneath the record. She had come from a woman who held on until the last possible moment and then let go cleanly. She had come from a woman who trusted the stranger to catch. She had been caught. She had been carried. She had been named before anything else. The rest of it, everything that had happened in the years between that window and this library table, was not the story of what she was. It was only the story of how long it took for the rest of the world to catch up to what had already been decided on a cold night on the river flats by a young woman at a window and a captain at the base of a building with her arms up. She had been worth catching. She had always been worth catching. She put the bag over her shoulder and walked out of the library into the afternoon. The first thing she did the following morning was find a family law attorney, a woman in a small office above the hardware store who dealt primarily in estate matters and had the organized patience of someone used to untangling what grief leaves behind. Nora sat across from her and laid out the situation in clear, precise terms. The journal, the bracelet, the fire report. Cap Voss's entries spanning 18 years. The documented attempts at contact. The attorney listened without interrupting, the manner good listeners do. When Nora finished, the attorney said that the documentation was unusually thorough and that the path to legal next of kin recognition was navigable, that it would take time and several filings, but that she had seen more complicated situations resolved successfully. She said she would take the case. Nora asked about her fee. The attorney looked at the canvas bag on the table and the worn jacket and the cracked watch and said they could discuss a payment arrangement. The second thing Nora did was drive out to the municipal cemetery with Freddie, who knew where the county section was because she had been to it before on her own for her own reasons which she did not explain and Nora did not ask about. The section was in the far corner where the ground flattened before it reached the back fence. The markers there were small, many of them the same standardized county issue name and date, and nothing more. Freddie found the one she was looking for and stood back. Nora crouched down in front of the marker. Lena Marsh, it said. A date of birth that would have made her 40 years old now. A date of death that was Nora's birthday. She had stopped at the gas station on the way out and bought a small bunch of yellow flowers from the bucket by the door. The kind that sit in buckets by gas station doors everywhere, cheerful and slightly past their best. She set them against the base of the marker. She stayed there for a while. She did not know what to say or whether saying was the right form for this. She thought about the photograph, the easy smile, the hair pushed back behind one ear. She thought about trust. She thought about letting go. She said finally quietly to the marker and the flowers in the cold ground, "Your name was the first thing I had. I didn't know that until 3 days ago, but you gave it to me before anything else, and I've had it the whole time." She stood up and put her hands in her pockets and looked at the marker for another moment. Then she turned and walked back to the car where Freddie was waiting. The truck stayed at Garrett's yard. Rex, in a conversation with Freddie that Nora was not present for, and did not ask about, renegotiated his contract with the steel buyer, and removed one item from the scrapping schedule. He did not explain his reasons to the buyer. The buyer, faced with a contracted rate for the other 20 tons of steel on the lot, did not push the matter. Yes, but the $12,000 from the canvas bag added to what Rex had given her was enough to cover the truck's assessed scrap value with a margin remaining. Nora paid it. She did not enjoy paying it, and she did not pretend that she did, but she paid it because owning the thing cleanly felt different from any other way of having it, and she had spent enough of her life in arrangements that were not clean. The truck was hers. It sat in the corner of Rex Garrett's yard for another 6 weeks while she worked out where to put it, because a 19-foot fire engine requires more consideration than a standard vehicle, logistically speaking. During those 6 weeks, she slept on Freddie's couch and worked the breakfast counter in the mornings, and in the afternoons drove up the Ridge Road to sit with Cap. Some days Cap was sharp, and they talked for hours. Cap asking questions about every house and every yard and every engine Nora had ever taken apart, storing the answers with the methodical attention of someone who intended to hold them permanently. Some days Cap was back at the station, back in a fire that had been out for decades. And on those days, Nora just sat beside her and let the old woman talk about whatever she needed to talk about, because sometimes being present is the whole of what presence means. Dutch slept in Cap's room every night. The administrator had completed her case-by-case review and filed it accordingly. In the second week of December, a mechanic named Orrin Stell, who ran a restoration shop 12 miles outside of Delwood, and who had once eaten at Freddie's counter every morning for a year, while his wife recovered from a long illness and had never forgotten it, offered Nora the use of his back bay and his expertise for what he called a reasonable arrangement, which turned out to mean she worked the shop 4 mornings a week, and he taught her what her library books had not. She took the arrangement. She drove the truck on its own power to Orrin's shop on a Tuesday morning in the third week of December, the diesel engine running rough, but running, and she pulled into the back bay with the overhead door open and the winter light coming in, and she cut the engine and sat in the cab for a moment with her hands on the wheel. She knew this cab. She knew the cracked vinyl and the fog gauges and the way the seat slid back on its track and the smell of rubber and old smoke that no amount of years had washed out. She had slept in this cab. She had read 18 years of someone else's grief in this cab. She had decided who she was going to be in this cab in the dark with $7 in her pocket and a stranger's journal in the exact weight of a thing she had not yet understood. She climbed down from the cab and walked around to the front and put her hand on the chrome bell. The legal filing for next of kin recognition took 4 months. The attorney was thorough and the documentation was solid, and Cap was present on one of her best days for the final hearing, sitting very straight in her chair with Dutch at her feet and Freddie 2 rows back in the gallery. The judge was a careful woman who read everything placed in front of her before speaking, and when she spoke, she did so without ceremony, simply stating the determination in plain language, which was the only language Nora had ever wanted anyone to use about her. On the afternoon of that day, driving back up the Ridge Road with Cap in the passenger seat and Dutch in the back, Nora said nothing for a long time. The valley was green now, the Ridge Road lined with the first growth of spring, the river catching the light through the new leaves below. Cap reached over and put her hand on Nora's arm, just resting it there without squeezing, without any of the supplementary signals people add when they want a gesture to mean something beyond itself. Just the weight of it. The simple, factual presence of a hand that had been trying to reach her for 18 years and had finally, in the particular way that things happen in the actual world, rather than the way you imagine them, arrived. The truck was finished in April. Orrin took 2 photographs of it in the bay before they moved it, one of the exterior and one of the cab, and he sent both to Freddie, who framed them and put them on the wall behind the counter where she put things that mattered. Nora drove it to a piece of rented ground outside of town, a half-acre with a gravel pad and a metal-sided equipment shed that she leased month to month while she worked out what came next. She was enrolled in the vocational program at the community college by then, the automotive technology track, where she was the youngest student by 15 years, and the one the instructor pointed to when he wanted to demonstrate what it looked like to already understand something before being taught it formally. On the last day of April, she drove the truck out to the cemetery in the early evening. She parked on the gravel path near the county section and sat in the cab with the engine off, in the spring evening coming in through the window. She had cranked down the smell of cut grass and turned earth, and something green in particular that belonged to this time of year in this valley. She had put fresh flowers on the marker that morning, yellow ones from the gas station, same as the first time, because some things you do the same way twice on purpose, because repetition is its own kind of faithfulness. She sat in the cab with her hands in her lap and the watch on her wrist, and the evening going slowly orange around her, and she thought about time, about the specific arithmetic of 18 years, about all the mornings she had woken before an alarm in borrowed rooms and looked at a cracked watch face and believed that being on time was the thing that would make the world see her correctly. She did not think that anymore. She had learned the difference between being on time and being found, and the difference turned out to be everything. Somewhere to the north, a freight train moved through the dark, the same sound it had always made in this valley, carrying something from somewhere to somewhere else across the long American dark. The river caught the last of the evening light below the ridge and gave it back in pieces, the same as it always had. Dutch was in the passenger seat. He had been in the passenger seat every time she drove the truck, as though this were the arrangement they had agreed to without discussing it, a compact made without words and honored without exception. He put his gray muzzle out the window and let the evening air move across his face with the complete satisfaction of an animal that has found its way back to the thing it was looking for and intends to stay. Nora reached over and put her hand on his back and felt his breathing slow and steady as it had been that first night in the dark when she had understood for the first time what it meant to have a warm thing beside you in a cold space. She looked out the windshield at the cemetery and the early stars coming out above the ridge and the darkening valley below. She thought about Cap up on the ridge road with Dutch at her feet and the journal on the nightstand, and a legal determination that said in plain language what had always been true. She thought about Freddie at the counter in the early mornings, the same routine she had held for 32 years, steady as a good bearing. She thought about Lena, 22 years old, at a window making the only choice there was to make with what the smoke and the heat had left her. She was 18 years old. She had $7 in a borrowed truck, and then she had nothing, and then she had a name that had been hers from the beginning, and a woman who had caught her falling, and a dog who had recognized the truck, and a mechanic who taught her what the books had not, and a legal determination in plain language, and a piece of rented ground with a gravel pad, and a future that was hers to build or not build, hers entirely with her own hands, starting from exactly this point and going forward into whatever the road held. She started the engine. The diesel turned over and caught and settled into its low, steady run, the same engine that had run toward other people's worst nights for 31 years, that had carried 4 people out of the river flats, and then sat waiting in a salvage yard for 3 years for the right person to climb in. It ran the same way it had always run, without any awareness of what it had carried, or what it meant, or how long it had been waiting. Machines do not know the significance of the things they carry. They just run. They run and they carry and they keep going until someone decides to stop them, and this one had not been stopped yet. She put the truck in gear and drove out through the cemetery gate and onto the road, and the chrome bell on the front bumper caught the last of the light and threw it back, and the road went forward, and she followed it.